holding paradoxes, understanding each other lives as a thing of its own between us, right? So I think via geometry, we're trying to formalize that, right? And seeing not just that there's a perfect sort of like coordinated pattern, but actually one that's mutating in real time, spatially and temporally in our brains, and more importantly, in the sort of third brain that emerges between us. I think what geometric hyperscanning can offer us is to name, the moments that matter in human connection. And by doing so, we can make them tractable for care.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Love and Philosophy. This is Andrea Hiott, and this podcast is about trying to hold what feels irreconcilable, trying to explore knowing from the heart, and these are mostly unscripted conversations with thinkers and seekers from all sorts of scientific and philosophic paths, and I'm really glad that you are here and that you are hopefully going to help us try to move beyond either or even figure out what that means, because we're all doing this together as we try to imagine a new philosophy of mind, a new philosophy of cognitive science, of understanding that sees paradox as a portal and sees what we've till now thought of as oppositional as maybe contrast that we can also see as somehow in a constellation with much more than we ever thought was possible. And I'm not the only host. You'll hear others if this is your first time. It's usually me, but other hosts also come on. We think of this as a community project, so anyone out there listening who has a wonderful idea for someone they should talk to about the themes of this podcast, or one of us should talk to about these ideas, then please do reach out. Send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. Today, our guest is Nicolás Heinrichs. He is a Chilean-German biologist and cognitive neuroscientist. He's investigating how minds coordinate in real time through something called hyperscanning, which is a wonderful word, hyperscanning. And I'm going to explain that in just a little bit. But he's at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences, and you've probably heard me mention that before because I was a guest researcher there for a while, and I also did my master's thesis as part of one of the labs there on these topics related to the hippocampus. So Nicolás and I are going to also be taking part in an active inference symposium, which is coming up pretty soon. So if you're interested in that and you'd like to hear more talks about hyperscanning, which is what we're going to talk about here, or about the hippocampus, which is what I studied, relative to some of the other ideas like kaleidoscopic cognition, which you've heard me talk about, and which I know sounds a bit crazy, but isn't, then check out the Active Inference Symposium. I'll put the links below. Should be just a couple days after this podcast comes out that you can watch it. Carl Friston will be giving the keynote, and there's lots of great speakers. So this conversation is just to get you ready for that in a way, but it also stands alone by itself. And we are also doing a piece on Substack about synchrony, brain synchronization. So have a look for that too. But today we're talking with Nico about hyperscanning. So hyperscanning is this neuroscientific technique that records brain activity from two individuals simultaneously while they're having some sort of interaction. We're going to delve into the mechanics of that here. We're going to talk about brain synchronization and how that might reflect shared attention, empathy, our effectiveness, communicating and coordinating. And we're going to touch on some broader issues about, how we bond, relationships, different kinds of disorders, how hyperscanning might advance our understanding of what social interactions are, and how this relates to various insights relative to philosophy and ideas of participatory sense-making, which you have heard of a lot in this podcast. And Nico's also working with a lot of these 4E cognitive science ideas, so you'll hear a lot of those themes resonating here too. We also highlight the potential of hyperscanning to maybe help us understand mental health better through something like holding paradox when it comes to how we're doing our science and what we're really thinking of as what mental is. This is a conversation that's really neuroscience related, as some of these are, but even for those of you who don't know anything about neuroscience, I think you'll still find a lot of interesting themes here which resonate with other episodes that we've had. If you are a neuroscientist and you already know everything about hyperscanning, you can go ahead and skip the next 4 or 5 minutes and get right into the conversation. Although you might want to think about this term geometric hyperscanning because it's something that Nico has come up with, and it's an empirical neuroscientific method, and there's no way I can completely describe it here because it has to do with Foreman-Ricci curvature and all these sort of topological reconfigurations. There are also other authors on that paper, like Mao Abarasan, who you may remember from this podcast. She's also going to be joining Nico and I on the Substack post. So anyway, I will put the preprint of their paper in the show notes if you're really into that kind of stuff and you want to look at it, because it has a lot to do with inner brain networks and entropy serving as a proxy for phase transitions, and it has some really interesting points about rupture and reattunement and co-regulation. And if none of this is making any sense to you, don't worry. It hardly makes any sense to me either, to be honest. Even so, I think there's something really important and interesting here regarding the themes of this podcast, even if we don't all understand it perfectly, what is being said and all of these ideas about active inference and geometric hyperscanning and whatever. But basically, we're looking at two, the dyad, even still in this paper. But I try to push us towards thinking about constellation cognition or cognition as a constellation. And Nico actually says he's thought about that before too, and even thought of that word before, so that's cool. So what does that mean? So right now, when we're dealing with hyperscanning, which I'll tell you about in just a second, we're usually looking at two different brains, a dyad. We're also looking at the alignment of those. But of course, misalignment or ways of layered alignment, if you think of it instead of just this linear either or, it's either aligned or not aligned. Actually, the brain is, multidimensional, multi-layered, and the ways that we measure it are often choosing a little part of it to measure. But what if we could understand ways and places where the brain is aligned and other places where it's not, and start to think of this in a more kaleidoscopic, there's that word, or constellatory way, so that we can understand how different alignments or misalignments might be telling us something when two people are in conversation. So Nico's new method is, at least as I understand it, is designed to capture these phase transitions and how two brains coordinate in social, emotional, affective interactions. So that's amazing because it's going beyond this normal temporal synchronization, and it's looking for structural changes in the actual network topology of the inner brain connectivity. So even though we're still dealing with two brains, this is a way of maybe thinking about it not as two, because as you'll hear him say, he's starting to think about the brain activity more as like a choreography or something, instead of these snapshots of, okay, here are brains aligned and here are brains that are not aligned. So it made me start to think about almost like a dancer, like this third entity. If you've heard that podcast that I had with Shay and Beck, about the third entity, this kind of entity that comes when two people are in a conversation. It's like the third thing, which is both of them. And what if we could better visualize that with our methods? Because that's what this is really. It's what we're talking about with the geometrics are our method, a way of doing something with the data that we get. So what if it could be like a kind of dance that we're watching of these two brains aligning, but also where they're not aligning, do you see what I mean? So yeah, that's a little far out, but I think it's worth mentioning because we do touch on it a bit in the conversation, and who knows, maybe somebody out there is listening to this and they'll know exactly how to kind of create something like that will help us all better visualize this third entity that is the conversation. Maybe not the conversation we're having with words or language, but that the bodies are having, that we're all having all the time with one another, that we're sort of co-creating one another daily with these ongoing bodily alignments and misalignments. As I was reading the paper, I was, of course, seeing it through my own lens, and I was thinking, okay, well, this is like a way for us to start to look at these many dimensions of alignment and misalignment not being necessarily an either-or thing, holding the paradox and all of these themes which this whole podcast is built around. That's the lens through which Nico and I discuss his work a bit, because he is also interested in these ideas, and his other work in different areas of social interaction is already, I think, trying to do this, to hold these seeming contradictions that, misalignment and alignment in the brain seem like you have to choose one or the other. But in actuality, when we're in a conversation, there's a lot of alignment and misalignment going on all at once. How do we explore whatever that is that's going to let us understand those and hold those as one? And that's this kind of holding paradox idea comes into play there. But, of course, that is itself a kind of care. That's what we talk about here. It's, really caring. Like, why do we need to do all this hyperscanning? I mean, the point is to try to help one another understand these difficult situations we're in when we have relations with each other and with ourselves, and that can be everything from mental illness to social issues, or just to maybe something that happens with you and someone you care about. And, what's this alignment, misalignment going on? Okay, so I know that's already way too heavy for a lot of you. So for those of you who haven't heard of hyperscanning, let me just talk about that for a second. Nico and I will go into it even more, but I just want to talk about how it's done. So basically you have these different ways of monitoring brain activity through like fMRI or EEG or functional near-infrared spectroscopy. I can never say that word right. FNIRS. There's all these ways, but just in general, you can think about, you've probably seen these ways that people wear these little like hats with wires on them to monitor their brain activity. That's one way, or in an fMRI. And that's what you'll hear Nico call these white tubes. You've probably seen them in the movies, or fMRI machines, these big long white tubes that you kind of go into. That's what we're talking about with the fMRI. In any case, you're monitoring the brain activity of two people at once, and they're engaging in some sort of interaction, playing a game or doing something on the screen at the same time, collaborative tasks. Sometimes these trials are pretty constrictive in terms of like how the body can move, but a lot of this new technology, that some of which I already mentioned, is helping us do it in ways where we can move around a lot more. So it's getting better and better. But the point is, you're analyzing the patterns of activity in the brain, whether it's blood flow or whatever, and you're seeing how those patterns relate between the two people, how they synchronize or how they couple between the participants. So it's a really fascinating technology, and we do find, that it does synchronize in social interactions, that certain brain regions do become synchronized between two people when they're doing activities together. So they can sort of align or almost mirror each other, or they just sort of become part of the same pattern, which is really fascinating. So this is helping us understand how our brains, our nervous systems, which are our bodies actually, they're not just these things in our heads, even though that's basically what we're measuring the activity in. It's actually a whole bodily thing, but we are coordinated together, and we change each other's movement and we change each other's pace when we are in conversation together. So hyperscanning is pretty new. I think it started in the early 2000s, and more people are starting to do it. And again, it's just the technology is getting a lot better, so it's becoming easier to be able to do this. I guess it's important to mention that we are talking about neural synchrony. So it's, patterns of neurons, which are all through the body, but of course these are mostly being measured in the brain, becoming aligned. That's a little bit different than, Jung's synchronicity, which I know a lot of you probably are thinking of that idea of Carl Jung's idea of meaningful coincidences. But these are philosophically pretty different terms here. So researchers have speculated a bit about whether there might be some inner brain synchrony going on with what Carl Jung calls synchronicity, or these meaningful coincidences, like when you're thinking about someone and they suddenly write you. But I'll just put that on the side. You can think about it, and maybe later I could write about how there might be some resonances between these ideas. But this is about the brain and about neural synchrony, about brain waves and activity levels falling and rising together, and patterns of cells firing, basically, or blood flow becoming temporally aligned, firing in coordination, so to speak. And it tells us about attention, about how we have conversations, what happens in our bodies as we're kind of taking turns talking. It tells us a lot perhaps about emotional resonance, empathy, joint action. Maybe you remember Fred and I talking about joint action and joint language. And, there's a lot of wonderful themes and layers from other podcasts that could be explored through this method of hyperscanning. And in fact, some of the philosophers and scientists that we've had on are working with Nico to think about how this might be done. So it all fits together in different ways. And it's also interesting to think of in terms of active inference and Carl Friston's framework, where, you're trying to minimize surprise or prediction error, and how this relates too with this synchronicity experience or synchronous experiences of the brain generating predictions about what's going to happen next, and how when you're matching with someone, you might be more easily able to, of course, predict what they're going to do next. But all that's just kind of speculation and just a little bit of titillation, I guess, to get you to go watch Nico's talk at the Active Inference Symposium. But for now, let's just go into the conversation and learn a little more about hyperscanning. I hope you're all doing well out there and having a good November, that things are going your way, that you're seeing some beautiful fall leaves somewhere. I was just driving through the country. I saw some really beautiful leaves and beautiful colors, and it's a wonderful time of year. So I hope you find a place to enjoy it and be away from your screen. And I send you a lot of good thoughts wherever you are in the world. Okay then, time for some hyperscanning. Trying to speak it has always been so hard.
Yeah, I know. It goes both ways though, because I was raised here in Germany, and Spanish wasn't, so I wasn't like raised biculturally from the get-go, because I guess in the 90s some paradigm reigned for some reason with like not confusing children. They didn't speak Spanish at home, so we had German and English, right?
Oh wow.
But then when we moved to Chile, I had to learn it, and then suddenly
How
I
old are you
realized
then?
that, like 11,
Oh, that's a hard time.
it's a tough moment, critical phase. And so then I mean, in retrospect, of course, I realized like, oh, Spanish is, a hurdle of its own, because usually people say German is trickier, but Spanish is like, it has so many times and very subtle pronunciations. So
I can imagine
they're
too,
both.
even more coming from Germany to like
Yeah,
it's a whole different kind of dance, isn't it? Linguistically.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Hi Nico. Welcome to Love and Philosophy. It's great to see you today.
Hi, Andrea. Thanks for having me. Such a fan.
So we're going to talk about something we haven't talked about ever on the show, and that is hyperscanning. I don't think many people will know what it is, so just from the start, maybe you could help us understand a little bit, if you don't mind. What is hyperscanning?
Absolutely. Yeah, my favorite topic. So, um, it just means that we record the brains of two people at the same time. That's sort of like the umbrella term. Then you can get like more nuanced in saying it's also people that are interacting. Um, and we want to overcome in my sort of broader project um, a couple of the limitations that I've seen in that type of methodology that belongs to social neuroscience mainly, in that the metrics that have been used and that have sort of like made up the field and sort of like make it stand for what it is nowadays, they're a bit limited in um, trying to point towards synchrony. So the coordination between people, but in a very sort of let's say simplistic way, right? It's like if you think of interaction, it's not just that you move in the same beat and then that constitutes your relevant marker, right? But it's there's more factors. I think of it like more as a choreography, right? And so there you also have other layers on top of the beat, right? And maybe sometimes that loosens or tightens and definitely shifts, right? So we want to acknowledge all of that in this very novel type of methodology that is brain imaging, just simultaneously so in people that are, interacting.
So for people who've never don't know what brain imaging even looks like, I mean,
Yeah,
are you just taking pictures of people's brains, or I mean,
sort of.
yeah. So could you try to set it up a little bit?
Sure.
What do you do when you do an experiment, for example? Are you a neuroscientist? Is that how you
Yeah.
would define yourself, or a psychologist, or both, or
I usually like to think of myself as a biologist.
biologist? Okay.
Yeah. With a
Neuroscientist biologist.
philosophical bent, maybe.
Okay, so when you're
Yeah.
doing these experiments, what does it look like just in general? Like if no one's ever seen it before, just describe
Right.
the room.
I think the most typical scenario would be a somewhat clinically looking room. So maybe, all white or all gray or something like that. So kind of like a very hygienic. Uh, and then if you want to have two people interacting, then you'll have sort of an isolated room for that within that larger lab where they can, be isolated from external noise. So in the case of EEG, it looks like a shower cap with electrodes, usually 64 placed through that cap, and then that one is really great in doing literally snapshots, as you were pointing out, but at a very high temporal resolution, right? So you can kind of get a video in a way. And then the spatial resolution will be a bit limited. So you will get the outermost part of the brain with that one mainly, and not dig deeper into the volume of the entire brain, right? And then if you move into other methodologies, that inverts slowly, where you get like really static pictures, but maybe not maybe, but you trade that off with volume so you can see structures in 3D. So yeah, it depends on what paradigm you're testing, whether you want to go with one or the other, but it's usually in that clinically looking room, and you will have people wearing or being maybe inserted into a tube, which would be the other extreme of the spectrum of methodologies, namely fMRI, where they barely can move, but we gain this insight that's volumetric into their brains. So yeah, you pick your poison.
And you're looking at the brain activity. We don't have to get into how all that happens
Hmm.
with blood flow and everything, but we're looking
Hmm.
at the brain and its activity. But hyperscanning is different because it's not just one person, which is what we all assume and what, that's pretty much all I ever did. And that's kind of the norm, you just one
Yeah.
person. So how are two people, we're looking at two brains at once with the same stimulus, or how would you describe?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it comes in all sort of flavors. For instance, right now we want to replicate a study made with fMRI that came out last year by Sebastian Speer from Princeton that explored interacting diets, so pairs, in a somewhat naturalistic conversation, right? So imagine the tube. So you're basically immobilized, but you're talking with one another. You can't really see each other, right? Because you're both stuck in tubes. So that detracts from the ecological validity, we call it. The fancy term to say like how representative of daily life that is. So we want to replicate that with a method that's called fNurse, which is mobile, and it still offers sort of a midway between EEG and fMRI in terms of spatial temporal resolution, as I was just describing, to enhance that ecological validity that's somewhat limited in the published article on that project. So you kind of, yeah, as I was saying, you have sort of a trade-off, right? And in that kind of paradigm, we're basically saying, if you're talking with one another, at least you, you need to be able to see each other, right? And then if you want to be even more naturalistic, maybe you can go into proxemics or haptics, right? People sort of like touching or like getting closer or more distance from one another, and that will certainly exclude already fMRI because you can't really do any of that within the tube. But then maybe you want to even move past fNurse into EEG to be able to interact even more. So yeah, it really will depend on the limitations of the technology, what kind of paradigm you can even think of to undergo without risking to have too much noise in your signal. You can think of the oscillations like in a lie detector for the audience, going like all over the place. And then that basically means that your data, once you want to do some calculations to make sense of it from a mathematical point of view, you can't because they're so spread out, so sparsed out everywhere that you can't pinpoint statistically meaningful markers from that data. So you kind of have to leverage that.
And what are you trying to figure out here? I mean, what's like, maybe we should talk about IBS or something, because
Yeah.
yeah, we can just assume we're trying to understand how two people are in relation together somehow,
Hmm.
and what the brain activity is doing at the same time. And the main idea is we're two people in relation, and we're looking at how our brains synchronize, I guess. Would you go into that word a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's sort of the hallmark metric of these simultaneous and interacting studies, which in a nutshell just means co-occurrences, right? So maybe that part of your brain is activated while that part in my brain is also activated, whatever that part is.
Yeah.
We'll skip that, the neuroanatomy for now. So what has been cool for the past 15 years to realize is that IBS, as you named it, interbrain synchrony, has been shown to, so the co-occurrence of activations in areas during these experiments has been shown to be, meaningful for a bunch of cognitive and interactive phenomena, right? Like, for instance, enhancing just mere comprehension between two interacting parties, right? So that tells you already that there is some kind of interplay at the neurobiological level that is accounting for or is in part a meaningful substrate to the phenomena, right? But we haven't moved past that, and I want to overcome just that simple synchrony, um, understood as co-occurrences, towards a more sophisticated mapping of each function in time and in space. That's basically the whole gist of it, right? It's not
Yeah.
just the canonic reproducing canonic work that asks, are these two individuals in sync? But actually, are there patterns that change as they talk and move, perhaps repair, during a misunderstanding? That's going back to the analogy of moving beyond the beat, which is like perfect coordination. Let's get it deeper into the real choreography, right? So that's basically what we want to do by making use of geometry to detect deeper patterns in the activations that we record with these electrodes.
A few of the conversations here, like with the neuroscientist Beck Todd, for example, and others, we talked about this kind of
Mm,
third entity idea, which I think relates
right.
very well here, right, to this synchrony. And that comes from dance, where the bodies are synchronized, so to speak. I mean, in a way, we can think of it in a really obvious way that when you dance, you have the music and you're sort of synchronized to the
Mm,
music. And so the bodies are synchronized. I guess we could think of the brain as, somehow in sync at the same time. But it's wonderful. This is a great paradox holding for me
yeah.
because we all understand that in a way. And it can be beautiful to think, oh, we're having a wonderful conversation and our brains are in sync. We can't get into how limited all of this imaging technology is, but we decide what we're going to look
Yep.
at. And we can look at what parts are going to be in sync. And there might be so much else that's changing all the time and not in sync.
Yeah, exactly. I love how you phrase it because it is indeed holding a paradox. I was just yesterday talking about the same topic, and it feels like to me, like the intuition that I have with this, because I don't consider myself a philosopher, but some of the ideas that I've had to incorporate, so based out of need to make sense of, to make a deeper sense of the topic at hand, right? With everything that it involves from a philosophy of science perspective. Um, I had been thinking of, the agential cut that one makes, and it's inevitable. So why don't we empower ourselves and, own up to it and say, okay, this is the agential cut. I'm not gonna discourse this away in a sort of neatly packaged paragraph in my paper. No, I'm actually gonna improve on the methods that are for me, the constituent part, or one of the, certainly one, but maybe the core of what scientific praxis is, right? So holding the paradox, sort of like motivating it all, and I want to not dissolve that in just words in my research, right? I want to that potential of the paradox to sort of like shine through the entire research. And so, as you say, that we have so many limitations with the tech, um, but we can certainly try to make sense deeper of what we have with those limitations. And I think it's fair to say that, hyperscanning is learning how to walk, if anything. It's very, very young as a sub-discipline, let's say. Um, it's not even a coherent discipline as of yet, right? That might even be a bit generous on my behalf because I like it. But it's not, there's not even agreement on what constitutes synchrony. For some, it's like areas in the brain, as I was saying before. For some, it's spikes in the oscillations, which is a completely different thing to consider. Certainly related in the same locus, sort of neurobiologically speaking, but completely different measure, methodologically seen. And so I'm even like motivated to try to write, call everyone on the hyperscanning front, to write a consensus paper, which most certainly won't have a consensus, but that's the point of it, to sort of make a snapshot, of, I guess it would be next year, 2026. What is synchrony now, for us, and then look and then maybe in the future, we can look back and say, oh wow, okay, all of these assumptions wrong, and some of them maybe held true. I think that's an interesting exercise to do. But I like the idea that you play the limitations of tech to the maximum, and see what's left.
It's not that those things have to be either or either, right? I
Mm.
mean, there's also a way in which there might be many different kinds of synchrony depending on
Yeah.
what the experiment is. There might be a definition of synchrony that's very general that could apply to all those, but each experiment's going to probably have its own definition, and you probably have to take whatever the experiment is as part of the
Mm. Mm.
definition. That still feels like a little bit hard to hold, or does it?
Yeah, no, I think that's true for me as well. I think you need to, for so many other disciplines as well, you kind of like need to be content with certain narratives or certain stories that can be also just stand alone and meaningful in being that. That's certainly progress on its own right? But I think in trying to tackle something like interaction, especially so because in the future I would like to apply this to mental health intervention. I think there's so many intimate nuances and responsibilities also in treating those topics, that deserve a more refined take, and not just your one research article, right? But like actually a body of frameworks that coalesce together to make it context sensitive, ethically grounded, and ultimately useful.
Yes, and also you did a paper with some people who've been Elena Kufari, and I know you're working with Hannah De Jager, and I know you've brought up Prisma in your paper, and
Yeah,
this, which is a kind of a different way of thinking about experiments too. The way you described the experiment at the beginning, we could have a very different setup where you don't just have the scientists sort of watching pictures of brains. Maybe there's some way to think about what's going on there, because that's what we really care about, isn't it? Like, you brought up mental health. These have very real implications, which
yeah,
with all this kind of talk and all these big terms that we're using, we can forget that all of this is actually towards the fact that in everyday life, interaction is so important, and our health is so tied to it.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, how do you think about that notion of synchrony in that kind of bigger way?
I think the main driver within that complexity for me is what I just mentioned in passing, namely the responsibility, right? If you have someone who's willing to seek change that's good, or foreseen, hopefully good for them, um, uh, in their life, and you're reaching out for someone to take on that sort of co-navigation, right? Then there's a huge sense of responsibility there, right? It's not just whether your method is ethically grounded, but it's a personal, very intimate a journey that you take on. So I think it's like only fair to bring together all of these complex considerations, because um, the journey by definition, by default, is complex, right? So I think it's only living up to that complexity, really, the fact that it's complex, maybe to the point of being a little messy too, right? But that's what drew me to neurophenomenology, and within that, talking to different researchers, I think a lot of these ideas have resonated very well with Elena and Hanne, who were introduced to me, by the way, by Nara Figueiredo first. So she was the first point of contact, I would say, for me with Prisma.
She's doing
I
very
had,
interesting work too, yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Elena
So we
actually
thought,
introduced me to her because they did a paper, right? Rather
yeah,
recently. Yeah.
and Synthese recently, yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And which I've always pronounced synthes, but someone
Indeed.
corrected me recently. Yeah, so I didn't, to be honest, I didn't know about Prisma until Nada introduced me to it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I I had of course read linguistic bodies, but I didn't know the core of Prisma as a methodology of its
It's
own,
pretty new though,
and
anyway. So.
yeah, that's true. And
Mhm.
maybe fast forward with the three of us, the four of us, sorry, I was excluding myself, um, are trying to extend Prisma. So, which is
Oh,
basically a method. I'm probably gonna butcher it if I try to explain it in detail. But let's say that it's a phenomenological methodology, right? For interacting groups, and where the participants are considered co-authors of your experiment, if you will, right? And there's feedback loops where that assure that they have that role. And so we want to extend Prisma, it's one way of saying it, um, into hyperscanning. Or we could also say we want to expand hyperscanning towards Prisma. It can go either way, but basically it's a way of grounding the search for a method that's neurophenomenologically framed via the neural substrate. And I think the broader implication or aim is also to build on a science of participatory sense making, right? To leverage all of these tools that have been coming up, but by these great researchers and sort of like pointed at neuroscience.
yeah. And this, I mean, for people who don't know, this is not exactly an easy task
Oh no.
to bring these things together. And we're trying to find ways to really look at what's happening, that
Mm.
we're not just in the lab and then we're in real life, or there's
Yeah.
not just philosophy where we think about what mind and consciousness are and then the way we study it in the lab. So
Yeah.
this interaction that you all are
Huh.
having, I find really beautiful in that way, because hyperscanning is a great place to try to work this stuff out. It's got to be messy. And I
Mhm.
actually just took part in a Prisma with Hannah,
Cool.
yeah, in Austria not too long ago. And I was really surprised by it because I hadn't thought a whole lot about it. I'd heard of it through, her work. Just briefly, for those who haven't heard, you really are the experiment. So
Mm.
I was the experiment with three other people, and it's hard to describe. It's a very different setup from what I'm used to in neuroscience, where everything is like you described at the beginning. So I love that that's even getting brought into the idea
Right.
of hyperscanning, and that maybe the technology has to kind of somehow come into that space, but
Mm.
also the philosophy has to kind of opens up another way of thinking about what science, the rigor is still going to be there. Have you had to
Exactly.
hold
Yeah.
those things in your work? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, I really like this concept that you brought up, the holding paradox, because I think that's for me the um, maybe maybe the second order sort of reason why or motivation of why to do this or why to attempt to do it, right? The primary motivator, of course, is care, right? But a second order one is that I think if we do not, steer ourselves in holding that paradox meaningfully, then we will tend to gravitate towards what I call unnamed centers, right, of attractions or attractors in a landscape of, discourses as researchers, as knowledge creators, um, what has been called social materially augmented research. I think Tom Fröse from Okinawa
Mm.
has called it like that, right? Because we have all these tools to sort of like pinpoint at concepts and then sort of augment them. Um, And I think the risk is that those centers that we cannot name can fill your own discursive considerations, or the considerations of your own praxis if we leave that unchecked, right? So I think that's why I think becoming, cherishing the holding the paradox, right, is I think
Mhm.
important to me as a secondary sort of motivator, and a sanity check in and of itself. Um, because if left unchecked, as I was saying, I fear that, something else will um, trickle into your discourse, or the discourse of your praxis, right? And I think in as I was saying before, like in in topics like these that deserve a specific kind of very detailed and nuanced view, that's crucial then. Um, yeah.
It's wonderful you brought up care alongside that, because that's basically this show in a way. I mean, I actually think what you described as, holding the paradox, or holding these contradictions or seeming
Mm,
opposite sides,
mm.
without trying to decide one is better than the other, and without trying to ignore one, in the way you were talking about, is a kind of care. I mean,
Yeah,
you have to sort of, that is a space
true.
of care, which is why it's so
Right.
hard. That also reminds me of other parts of your work where I think you're also, through care, through affect and emotion, even if we
Hmm.
want to put it in the kind of more scientific language, but I feel like it's coming from that space of care. You're also trying to hold these, and just to go back to that idea of synchrony, where it's not so simple. We aren't just holding this space where we all line up perfectly and everything's aligned, and so we all fully
Yeah,
understand each other, and that can be an image of it. But in your work, you're also always bringing in the tension and the rupture, and the fact that
exactly.
the
Yeah.
point isn't just to match
Yeah.
to each other. As you were saying before, we're sort of aligning, and how are we, kind of moving through this together in a way. Can you talk about that a little bit? Is that important for you? What does that bring up?
Yeah, no, that's great. I think the crux that I see in trying to create this participatory hyperscanning, if you will, is precisely overcoming these like linear views of like the perfect mirror image in interacting parties, right? And I think it's very intuitive to see the benefit of recognizing that, for instance, misunderstandings, under a perfect mirror image, there would be noise, right? But it turns out there are signals, there are meaningful signals instead, right? In everyday life, right? So why don't we operationalize them within our experimental paradigms as such, instead of, regressing them out of our math? So I think that's sort of been the crux, in the sense that that's where I want to go at. We're not there yet, but that's also, what I see as the core of what will constitute an improvement in how we do social neuroscience as a whole. And then based on that, I would hope to, start decomposing different pillars, I would say, of interaction, right? To see how, the same way that we're saying, there's no, perfect mirror instance of these phenomena within interaction. There's rather, phase transitions. You flip states during a conversation. And so you need to think less about an average harmony, right? Or a mean harmony, and you need to think more of transformations. And I say, this is the imperative voice. I apologize for that, but that's it's just me saying, I think that we should do this.
Part of this whole relationality we've talked about, there's two. And so there's the self navigation, which you might think of like where
Mm,
we are ourselves trying to navigate through whatever is happening. But we've been talking about this relational
mm,
thing. So you brought up some terms there, and made me think of like a manifold, or
right.
that everything can kind of be seen different ways, according to what we're trying to study or look for. So does that relate to what you were saying about it's not just about, matching to each other? Because I'm trying to get towards your geometric way of thinking about hyperscanning, because for me,
Right.
when I was
Yeah.
reading about that, it opens up more like a manifold or like a constellation,
Yeah.
instead of this linear, kind of way that we've thought about it before. So, because
Yeah,
it might
yeah,
not be just a dyad, it could be a triad or whatever. I mean, this
yeah.
generative systems, come in many forms. So, do I read that correctly? Are you trying to kind of constellate what is linear?
Absolutely. I think I might have used that word in the past, actually. Now
Oh,
it's sort of a,
wonderful.
feels
I
like
didn't
a,
even know if it was a word, but I use it all
yeah,
the
yeah,
time,
yeah. Yeah,
constellatory.
I think at some point I wrote something about cognitive constellations.
Oh, wow. You have to
But
send me
it
that
feels
if you
like a,
find it.
I will. So, but it felt like a nostalgic echo, you know. I
Oh,
will
wonderful.
dig that up.
Oh, please
But
do.
yeah, absolutely. I think this goes back to active inference and inaction, I think. So you co-predict and co-regulate. I would say that those are the, respective take-home messages from those frameworks for this. So, understanding each other, it lives as a thing of its own between us, right? So I think via geometry we're trying to formalize that, right? And seeing not just that there's a perfect sort of like coordinated pattern, but actually one that's mutating in real time, spatially and temporally in our brains, and more importantly in the sort of third brain that emerges between us. And we can see is a certain moment in time that we can describe neurophenomenologically.
That's a big
So
word, neurophenomenology. Yeah.
at the discourse level, with the proxemics, with the haptics, etc., whatever you choose to have in your multimodal paradigm, right? And mix and match that with your neural signals, then it would be certainly meaningful whether your network is perhaps more local or globally spread between us. Are we in agreement? Are we in disagreement at time X, and then it suddenly changes. So I
Yeah.
think to me that's the only, or the most natural way to move forward with the current tech we have for that, in thinking that, if we assume that this is true, that we co-predict each other and at the same time we're co-regulating each other and interaction is its own thing, then we need to dig deeper and not just take these snapshots that have shown us important correlations, but are limited in showing us these more mechanistic implications of these
Yeah.
modalities.
That reminds me of you write about time and temporal things a lot and, related to emotions because what you just said and this whole constellatory
Mm.
cognition, often when we're communicating together, we might be in sync in some parts, but
Yeah,
maybe I'm reliving something based on the words that you said. And I know
yeah,
you talk about something like temporal aiming, where so my
yeah,
trajectory is I'm aimed towards my past and I'm kind of thinking about something in the
right,
past, and maybe you're looking towards the future. And so
exactly.
maybe there's a part where we're synchronized, but we're really aiming temporally in different ways, which can cause trouble. And that seems incredibly complicated to try to actually model in science and
Yeah.
visualize. But I feel like you're trying to move towards that with the geometric idea or with this constellatory idea, right? We first have to kind of imagine it before we can start to model it. Is that fair to say? Are you thinking about that
Yeah, yeah,
too? Or
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's a fair description for sure, because these spaces are oriented, right? And so it was Mao, who you've interviewed before, who came up with temporal aiming while we were writing our paper that got accepted, by the way, at the International Workshop um, of Active Inference. So we'll be
congratulations.
presenting that in a couple of weeks. Thanks. And so I think it's a work in progress for sure, but we've already established that, for our model, it can only make sense if we take into consideration these, as you exemplified, retrospective and prospective orientations that you will have in holding the spaces of knowledge about the other and yourself in relation to the other during communication or interaction. So that'll be a big one to formalize further and put to the test empirically.
That's wonderful. I'm really excited about that and about just trying to think of, even if we just try to think of this as like a landscape that we can
Mm.
always take many different paths, and how do we visualize that and how do we, even put math on that just to model it so we can all kind of look at it
Yeah.
and see that maybe we're not always in the same place. And
Yeah.
I find that really inspiring. I don't know if there's anything about the geometric evaluation method relative to this kind of inner brain network stuff that you want to say here. I can just point people to the paper, but it is kind of a new way of thinking about all of this, right? About,
Yeah.
yeah, how would you, I know you can't summarize it. It's very hard. Most people don't even understand active inference, including me probably. So even though I've studied it forever. So, but yeah,
Same.
like for people who, are just curious, like what's different about this? What would you, is it this opening of space?
Yeah, I think it's giving us a glimpse into um, how it might be, more biologically realistic, um, a realistically depicted account of interaction, right? So it might in and of itself be its own sub-discipline perhaps in the future, or as we're playing a bit around with Elena and Hannah and Nara, maybe framed within participatory sense making, or maybe our collaborator Guillaume Dumas just brought out a generative account of neurophenomenology. So maybe we steer it also more towards the machine learning side of things. The future, of course, will show what ends up being the space of probabilities that
Yeah.
ends up coalescing best with a method like that. But I think it's fair to describe it as you say, in sort of already from the get-go, from its inception, it is intended to uh, to be responsive and attentive towards the co-regulation and co-prediction of beings. Um, so I think, yeah, even if I do say so myself, I think it's a promising avenue in regards to making
Mhm.
interaction be lived up to in the lab, right? Instead of just being explained away by your consensus on neuroanatomy, or sort of relinquished from the lab entirely via just being limited to discursive practices that don't get to mingle that intimately with neurophysiological studies, right? So
Mhm.
we're trying to merge them, or integrate these approaches, and advance a fuller account of interaction. And as we were discussing before, because of the importance that it holds in therapy or parenting, even broader in society, right? Um, so that's I think that's the general direction. Yeah.
We were talking about holding the paradox or holding these seeming opposites, and if you can kind of visualize or imagine some sort of shared generative manifold, that might even be
Yeah.
Mal's kind of terminology for it, or yours. I don't know
Yeah.
who says what in what papers or where, but you can, if we start having ways to visualize this, maybe we can start to understand that, we might be sharing the same space and
Yeah.
synchronizing, and also experiencing that same space completely differently at the very same
Yeah.
time. It feels really important. And it also feels important to other parts of your work when you talk about asymmetry, or when you
Right.
talk about neuroprotective rituals, for example,
Right.
because another weird thing here is that every brain is different. So even when
Yep.
you're setting up the hyperscan, you really actually need to kind of be able to configure it completely different for every brain. So there's all these levels of this
Yeah.
holding of paradox. But do you see that
That's true.
connected to, for example, how you might help someone who's struggling, with
Yeah.
mental
Yeah.
illness or something? Yeah,
Absolutely. That's
yeah.
that's the entire sort of intention behind that. Um, Now that you pointed to the neuroprotective rituals, that's actually a term I came up with very recently in our conversations with Mark James from the Okinawa
Oh
Institute
yeah,
of
wow,
Science and
great. He's been
Technology.
on the podcast.
Yeah, a lot of our work sort of seems motivated by similar sort of intentions of care, although our
Mhm.
works don't intersect formally yet. So it's
I think
been
we're
really
all trying to reach
interesting.
towards each other, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I
Trying
agree.
to find each other.
Yeah, and neuroprotection as a whole, as a thing exists, of course. It's a sort of a medical technical term, but the neuroprotective rituals is something that we came up with, Mark, during our conversations, and it's sort of hinting at um, possible solutions to issues such as, for instance, chronic inflammation of the brain, which usually happens as a response to some external agent, or, for instance, um, stress, which can be, as Agustin Ibáñez showed last year, I think, in Nature, can also, be produced by social inequality, right? So if you point your research at something like that, you can certainly try to help people in overcome um, the situation where their brain is just under constant um, disadvantage, if to not say under constant sort of pathological even influence, right, by circumstances that we all share, right? So I think that's where the notion of like having rituals which perhaps can not just recreate, but even complement and enhance therapies that are metabolite based. So something that you
Mm.
ingest, right? Or something that is sort of done to you as a passive client or patient, which is sort of passive is in the definition of patient, right? So it's something that you can, actively seek. And so that's, I think, how we want to close the loop there in using interpersonal synchrony, right? As a more global sort of account of synchrony within which interbrain synchrony is one of possible synchronies, um, to entrain, autonomic, effective cortical systems to be more adaptive against these stressors, right?
Hmm. When you were talking, for example, I was thinking of how lonely people feel when they don't
Yeah,
seem to be experiencing the world the way others are.
right.
You know what I mean? Whatever kind of, if you want to call that an illness or a misalignment or whatever,
Yeah,
even though they are sharing that space. So there's rituals tend to bring us into shared space, I guess,
true.
right?
Yeah,
But if we could also understand that we're coming into shared space and we're all going to experience it differently. It's not an either or. Then
yeah,
it could be really helpful because you don't feel so lonely because
yeah,
you're sharing the ritual, which is what rituals help us do. And
true.
then at the same time, it's okay that you're not experiencing exactly the same way as someone else. Like that becomes almost like a
Yeah,
portal,
yeah,
you know?
yeah.
I find that really exciting, right? To
Oh, that's great. Yeah,
think
yeah.
about
I like that.
what that could do or help.
Yeah, I think that's great. It sort of made me think of Michael Levin, who you've also had on the podcast,
Who's also
who
trying to
speaks
open this manifold of
exactly,
cognition. Yeah.
exactly. And for me, it resonates with ideas of his where, I don't know where he said it, but he was speaking about intelligence, right? And how it is shared by definition in the sense of it being something, or was it consciousness? Regardless, he was speaking about how we as agents sort of tap into it, right? As almost as something that's feels like phrased like that as if it's something else, right? Or something beyond ourselves that we access to, but it's really just a way of saying that it's, biologically realistic
Mm,
as a reality, as an aspect, right?
right.
And so I feel that when we talk about rituals, maybe people tend to think of, or one could read this as sort of an exercise of sociology, but and it can, but I think it's not just that. I think it's saying that the space between agents is socially distributed as a biologically realistic thing, right?
Mm,
So I think that's where we're tapping in with the neuro side of things, right? We're trying
yeah.
to understand how the unfolding inside of a system um, is indeed capturable in a meaningful way, right? By interacting agents. In our case, we're
Yeah.
limited to diet duos right now, but we at some point we'll definitely have to scale this up to collectives. But yeah, so I think it's both, right? It's sort of the social biological view that all of these matters are distributed, hence the possibility of modulating their intrinsic dynamics
Mm.
by different methods, right? Not
Yeah.
just the
Yeah.
metabolite route in the institution, right? But other ways are possible too.
And even just seeing the dyad differently, you're already doing something there. You're not just assuming the dyad, you're doing what you brought up at the beginning of, you know, seeing that you're using the dyad, but it could be, a constellation. And also when you were talking, I was thinking of that cognition or consciousness, or that understanding that we've kind of tapped into it, as you put it, is
Mm,
also just kind of the tip of the iceberg of actually what cognition is. I mean, when we
right.
become aware of it and when we're thinking about it, that cognitive light cone, to talk about Mike Levin or something, that too is nested, right? And we,
True.
the same model could kind of help us understand that too, because it's a quite a hard thing to really take in without going crazy. I mean, that's that old Fitzgerald quote, right? How to hold two opposed ideas in mind at once and still say
Yeah.
sane. But I'm hearing a lot in everything that you're saying, and I'm wondering about you and your path and how you got here. Like,
Mm.
how did your relationality, how did you get here, Nika?
Yeah, yeah, sure. I can try. It feels like I should, start like autobiographically. Um, but yeah, I think that might perhaps ease the narrative, the autobiographic part in relation to that sort of curiosity, I guess, and the loving to learn type of, epistemic stance, I guess, that I do, perform on a daily basis. That was definitely, scaffolded on top of, what my parents or our parents, because I have a bigger sister, older sister, um, offered us, right? They were really doing cool stuff, right? My mom, a cello player, my dad, a theoretical physicist, very open disciplines, but very focused disciplines too, right? So
Yeah,
holding paradoxes.
so much discipline and yet
Yeah, yeah, and
so much
and and
expansion.
then and then but I think throughout that all of that discipline and like, the learning to love, sorry, the other way around, loving to learn, although that also kind of like you find, throughout all that discipline, you also find your desire, right? And what you want to apply this to. And I think that's also something that I talked with Mark about a lot. It's like there's certainly, episodes in life where you thought, okay, this is, unacceptably, underdetermined from the perspective of science. Something like, for instance, mental health intervention, where even one of my collaborators, dear Leonard Schilbach, has, admitted that. And this is a term, a technical term, that a lot of work in that area in cognitive neuropsychiatry is based on what's called referred to as a clinician's intuition, right? So I think it's just not enough, right? We need to double down and drill down, on what is underlying all of this, because of what's at stake, right? And so I think all of that sort of curiosity that comes from a really nice place, from my life history and a bunch of influences, I felt sort of, that I had to direct it to something that actually matters. Because if not, then I feel that, the exercise of critique or the exercise of traversing data spaces are both in and of themselves, just stale, right? But I think combined and geared towards something that is of benefit for someone else, that is sort of like golden. Yeah.
It's interesting that I was thinking when you're about therapy. I mean, of course, most therapists are doing their best, I guess, but what we were talking about before, we're all coming from a certain path. So it's that same what you're trying to do with your work. I can see how it could help with that,
Mm.
because if the therapist and the person who's, in the therapy, if there was some way to understand that you're not just making your best intuition, or that you are, but you're pinpointing that, you're saying that, and maybe there's some kind of resource for how to, I don't know what, try out different ways. Or, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, these things are also kind of powerful in their immediacy, these kind of relationships, like with the
Mm.
therapist. Or, when your mom, she probably practiced so much and it's so disciplined, but then there's this
Right.
immediacy and the people
Right.
just feel it. And it's like, we don't want to,
Yeah.
we also don't want to over structure that. So do you see what I'm
Huh.
saying? Do you ever feel that kind of tension where you wanna let the magic happen too, right? In
That's true. Yeah.
how do you, I find that a very hard thing to in this, what we were talking about with this, for example, participatory sense making meeting,
Yeah.
hyperscanning.
Yeah.
Um, how do you not over determine it or under determine it to kind of think about Hannah's ways of talking about love,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, yeah, that's so interesting. I think I would even contend that we're in an era where that is actively being done, right?
Right.
So you reduce mind to brain, you reify signals from the brain that's being read and used as a proxy to describe the mind, right? And around that, there's certainly, forces building what I guess Foucault would have called, biopolitics, and Byung Han calls psychopolitics, and perhaps we could call it neuropolitics nowadays, right?
Mm,
Where our attention and emotions, etc., are being commodified. So I think what you're pointing out is not just a question mark to contemplate, but to actually act upon. You know. Um, Definitely. And I'm not talking about, futuristic risks, but something that we can actually trace, right? So I think maybe that will have to be studied in groups that have to do, with regulatory frameworks and policies. I'm thinking here of something that's instantiated in a perhaps in a legal way, right? But I think that's my way of saying this whole sort of uh, perspective on how these milieus, these different spaces of knowledge about ourselves.
mm,
It's not a question of whether they are connected or not, right? It's they already being made use of in a connected way, right?
right.
So I think we need to pay more attention to them. I don't know if that answers the question, but
Yeah.
I went to that place.
No, it makes sense. And
Yeah.
somehow I was also thinking that maybe you learned how to hold these differences growing up the way you did,
Mm.
with having the hard science and the art, and
Right.
maybe seeing that both had parts of each other in them or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Do you
absolutely.
think
I
that's
think that's
helped with
what.
you bringing this in?
Yeah, yeah, totally. Because there's like this sort of functionalist view, if you will, like how things can actually matter on a math point from
Yep,
a math
yep,
point of
yep.
view. But
Mhm.
there's also the participatory, and I think there's some flexibility that you need to traverse those perspectives, right? And I don't think either is the full picture, right? Um, so I think that's actually sort of where I sit most comfortably in trying to juggle both.
Yeah, you probably learned it in your existence, as a kid, that
I
because
think
I've
so.
always found
Yeah.
those worlds, people seem to think they're so different, but they
Yeah.
hold similar constellations, or they just do things, they do the things differently, but both have kind of the rigor, for example, and the
Yeah.
expansive, soul
Yeah.
soul part too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
taking those both seriously at the same time, as we've said, is hard. But just to kind of
Yeah.
come back to hyperscanning, just to end, I'm going to ask you
Mm.
an impossible question.
Okay.
How does this relate to the way that we do care for each other? Can something come from hyperscanning that helps us widen the circle of care? What do you really feel about that? Does it help us? Could it help us? How do you see it?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. Thank you. So if we're holding the paradox, I think what geometric hyperscanning can offer us is to name, the moments that matter in human connection. And by doing so, we can make them tractable for care.
Do you have any kind of connections to love or anything about that word that you might want to share at all?
Yeah. I think I'm feeling like I want to tell you, but perhaps not the listeners.
That's fine. Okay, I can go ahead and stop it then, so then you can feel safe. How about that?
Thank you. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
Hey everyone. We stopped recording there and didn't actually kind of say bye, so I just thought I would say bye. Thanks for listening, and if you want to support the project, this endeavor, it would be much appreciated. Just sign up for the Substack or do the Buy Me a Coffee, which is new, but no one's used it yet, or send an email and tell me what you'd like to see more of on the show. Whatever. Anything you can do to support this, help us, would be really appreciated. All right, hope you're doing well. Bye.